Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay. I call the Space Court Foundation video series to order. Welcome, my name is Chris Hearsey and I am the co-founder and chair of the board of directors for the Space Court Foundation. Thank you for joining us today for our panel co-hosted with UNIDROIT titled Reimagining the Space Protocol, Examining the Cape Town Convention Amid Emerging Space Activities. The Space Court Foundation is a 501c3 educational nonprofit corporation that promotes and supports space law and policy education and the rule of law. The Space Court Foundation produces educational materials and scholarship through the administration of several major projects, which includes our educational animated space law program titled Stellar Decisis, our research program under the Space Court Law Library, and our new series on YouTube called The Spacebar Show. The foundation also engages in partnerships and collaborations that help grow greater awareness of space law and how disputes in space may be resolved as humans venture further from Earth in the not too distant future. For more information about our mission, programming, and internship program, we ask that you visit our website at spacecourtfoundation.org. We also wish to thank the Open Lunar Foundation for sponsoring our video series all of 2021. For more information about the Open Lunar Foundation, please visit their website at openlunar.org. We greatly appreciate the strong support of the space community and invite you to follow us on social media for the latest information. You can find archived versions of all our programs on YouTube. Just search for the Space Court Foundation channel. If you enjoy our programming, please remember to like today's video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Your continued support helps us keep providing you contemporary, innovative programming. Please consider supporting us through Patreon in our merchandise store, Celestial Objections Apparel on teespring.com. All proceeds go to the foundation to cover the cost of our programming and support our intern projects. Before we begin, I'd like to thank Hamza Hamid for organizing this excellent panel and Daniel Porras for moderating this distinguished panel of experts to discuss the space protocol of the Cape Town Convention and its applicability to emerging space technologies. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Anna Veneziano. Professor Veneziano serves as Deputy Secretary General of the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, UNIDROIT, and is full professor at the University of Teramo in Italy, where she was formerly the director of the Department of Private Law. From 2013 to 2018, Professor Veneziano served as professor of European property law at the University of Amsterdam. Her education includes a law degree from the University of Rome La Sapienza and an LLM degree from Yale Law School, funded by a Fulbright scholarship, and she completed her PhD degree at the University of Florence. Thank you for joining us today, Professor. Looking forward to this amazing panel, and I now turn the program over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris, for this very kind introduction. I am very pleased to add my welcome on behalf of UNIDROIT to our great speakers, with many thanks for their availability to share their expertise with us, and to you all for joining the webinar. And a special thank goes to the Space Court Foundation for partnering up with UNIDROIT in this venture. And if I may, to our moderator, Daniel Porras, and to my colleague Hamza Hamed for organizing it. As many of you will know, UNIDROIT, the Institute for the Unification of Private Law, International Institute, is a global intergovernmental organization which develops uniform laws in various sectors, one of them being facilitating access to credit, and the Space Protocol is part of this. And this webinar, as Chris said, entitled Reimagining the Space Protocol. Indeed, the idea is to engage speakers and audience in looking at the protocol to the Convention on International Interest in Mobile Equipment on matters specific to space assets adopted by UNIDROIT in light of the rapidly developing space industry and its many facets. But I don't want to take too much time out of what our great speakers will say about it. And so it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of the webinar, my good friend, if I may say so, Daniel Porras, who will be the first speaker. I'm not going to introduce him using all his full and well-deserved achievements because you have them in the documents for the webinar, and you probably know him already, many of you at least. But among his many achievements, let me at least say that he worked at UNIDROIT on the space protocol in the period when the study group was discussing it, so he knows very much about it. But before giving the floor to Daniel, allow us to show a very short video produced by UNIDROIT to give an overview of the space protocol and its aims. It's no more than 4 minutes, so don't worry, but I hope you will enjoy it. And many thanks to Hamza Hamid, my colleague, for this video. So Hamza, over to you.
Just a second, everybody. Let me quickly put up the video. There we go.
The Protocol to the Convention on International Interests in Mobile Equipment on Matters Specific to Space Assets, better known as the Space Protocol to the Cape Town Convention, is an international treaty adopted in Berlin in 2012 which facilitates the use of asset-based secured financing for the space sector. Developed and negotiated under the auspices of the International Institute for the Unification of Private Law, or UNIDROIT, the Space Protocol is part of the Cape Town Convention system, which also includes protocols for the aviation, rail, mining, agriculture, and construction sectors. The Space Protocol allows for the creation, registration, and enforcement of international interests in space assets, which can either take the form of a security agreement, a title reservation agreement, or a leasing agreement. As the space sector continues to grow and more emerging countries and companies from different parts of the world start to get involved, access to credit and availability of finance at reasonable terms will be key in order to allow businesses to develop and space economies to expand. The Space Protocol allows private investors to lend across borders with certainty and confidence that should anything go wrong, their rights and interests in their space assets will be upheld in a court of law, as long as the debtor is based in a contracting state of the protocol. The Cape Town Convention and its aircraft protocol have been described as some of the most commercially beneficial treaties ever adopted. The convention presently has more than 80 contracting states from all parts of the world. The Space Protocol adapts the provisions of the convention to the specific needs of the space sector. The Space Protocol scope covers all types of space assets in space or designed to be in space, and includes objects such as satellites, transponders, reusable launch vehicles, rovers, space infrastructure, and others. Once a creditor and a debtor enter into a security agreement, a title reservation agreement, or leasing agreement, the creditor can register its interests in the space asset into an international wholly electronic registry. Once registered, this international interest has priority over subsequently registered interests, domestic law interests, as well as unregistered rights and interests in the case that the debtor becomes insolvent. The Space Protocol has specific provisions that cater to the special characteristics of the space market and the assets involved. Thus, it provides for creditors remedies that take the in situ nature of space assets into account. For example, by providing for the use of mechanisms such as the transfer of tracking, telemetry, and control information of a space asset, or the assignment of debtors' rights. Additionally, the Space Protocol also has specific provisions for other space-specific issues, such as physically connected space assets, salvage for insurers, and space assets which serve a public service. Insolvencies of space companies result in the creation of space debris. Not only will the Space Protocol allow for access to space to a larger number of private companies from all parts of the world, it will also provide for sustainable space exploration through providing an efficient mechanism for the in situ transfer of space assets to new operators. The space sector is no longer the realm of a handful of operators providing a limited number of services. It is now the domain of smaller, leaner, more innovative businesses which make up the new space industry. Studies predict that the size of the global space sector to be as large as 1.1 trillion by 2040, with thousands of assets being sent to space every year. The Space Protocol is perfectly suited to serve as a tool to facilitate this growth and allow more capital to flow into space businesses of all natures and sizes. UNIDROIT and its partners are continuing to promote the Space Protocol to establish the international infrastructure required for its entry into force. We are also actively engaged with governments and policymakers looking to provide their space industries with an additional channel through which they can finance their space ventures. Please contact the UNIDROIT Secretariat for any further inquiries about the Cape Town Convention or its protocols.
Thank you very much, Hamza, for that excellent video, and welcome everyone to the next edition of the Space Court Foundation webinar series. My name is Daniel Porras, and I'm really delighted to be participating today in this joint webinar that we're doing on the Cape Town Convention and the Space Protocol, which, as Anna said, this is where I got my start. I got to work on this project for about 5 years, and back when I was working on this project, the vast majority of discussions that when we talked about applications of the Space Protocol revolved around telecommunication satellites. But one of the things that's been really exciting to see since I was working on the protocol those years ago, and it's not that many, okay, I'm not that old, we've started to see so many new applications and so many new activities that it's really a treat for me to be here involved in this discussion with some of these experts to start rethinking about where is the place of the Space Protocol in the wider space economy, and what could it offer different types of space applications. Now, we just saw this video. I know for all of our friends who are from the space community, you probably have a lot of questions about space finance, and for those of our colleagues from the finance community, I'm sure you're going to have a lot of questions about some of the space technology that we're going to be discussing. So please feel free to put your questions into the Q&A section below, and we will be answering those once we kind of get into a discussion. Now, to all of my speakers, I'm really delighted to have you all here. I'll introduce you all in a moment, but just to remind everyone, this is supposed to be a discussion. We want to make sure that we're here having a very free-flowing, easy talk, and so we're not going to make a lot of presentations, but I'm just going to ask a series of questions, get things moving, and then we can start really thinking about what is the applicability of the Space Protocol to some of the exciting new technologies that we're seeing emerging in space. So with that, Anna, you've already been introduced, and of course, you've given me a wonderful and very kind introduction as well. Allow me to present Mr. Hamza Hamid. In many ways, I feel like I handed off my my responsibilities to Hamza. Hamza is a Pakistani lawyer working as a legal consultant for UNIDROIT in Rome, Italy. You're very fortunate, sir. His primary focus is on secure transactions, law, and fintech, whereby he works on the Cape Town Convention, its various protocols, with a particular focus on space financing. So I'm really delighted that the protocol has come into such great hands. In addition, let me introduce Mr. Jack Wright Nelson. He's a research associate at the National University of Singapore Faculty of Law, where he focuses on Asia-Pacific satellite regulation and financing. Prior to joining the faculty, Jack practiced law with King and Wood Melsons in Hong Kong and Singapore. We also have Ms. Nida Senturk. Nida is a lawyer admitted to practice law in Turkey with the Istanbul Bar and holds an advanced LLM degree in air and space law from Leiden University. She is also the Middle East Regional Communications Manager for the Space Generation Advisory Council of the United Nations Program of Space Applications. And then last but not least, of course, Mr. Chris Hearsey, founder and CEO of OSA Consulting and also one of our co-founders of the Space Court Foundation. Chris has over 10 years experience in the aerospace and nonprofit, excuse me, in the aerospace and nonprofit sectors, previously serving as a director of DC operations and corporate counsel for Bigelow Aerospace, as well as deputy CEO of chair of board of directors for the Astrosociology Research Institute. And in fact, one of the conversations that Chris and I had many of those years ago was precisely when he was working on these space habitats. And I actually started asking myself as well, would the Space Protocol be able to finance something like a space habitat? But years ago, maybe that didn't make as much sense as it does today. So we'd like to re-explore that, that very notion. And to kick things off, Jack, I'd like to turn to you first. Give us a little bit of context. You know, where is the space economy right now? What kinds of space activities are we seeing? And what are some of the hurdles that folks are facing when it comes to finding the mass amounts of finance that is required to kick off a space business?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Daniel. I think, to sum up where the space industry is and what the current situation is, we can actually turn back to a pretty old saying, which is a pretty old saying, at least within the space industry, which is no bucks, no Buck Rogers. So what this saying kind of gets at is that, bucks, cash, money, but Buck Rogers was a spacefaring science fiction hero of long ago. So what are we saying? We're saying that without money, space activities simply just don't happen. And you could say, well, that's the same for pretty much every human activity, and that might be true to an extent. But space, as you just mentioned, Daniel, does remain a particularly expensive industry to participate in. So that's not to say it hasn't gotten cheaper, and it certainly has, and I'm sure everyone's seen the amazing launches from SpaceX, from Blue Origin, from Virgin Orbit and whatnot. So the rise of reusable rockets, increased competition have made significant changes, but overall it does remain capital intensive. So where does the money come from these days? Well, we can think historically, and we can discuss how government funding is still very important. And indeed, it was government funding that was absolutely pivotal at the beginning of the space age. It's what got Yuri Gagarin into space. It's what got Neil Armstrong on the moon. But government funding fluctuates in accordance with political priorities, and it's not generally available for a strictly commercial entity. So what do today's aspiring space businesses do to raise money? Well, like many other businesses, they often face a choice between debt and equity financing. But you mentioned barriers, Daniel, and I think that's probably one of the key inhibitors of the industry at the moment. It's that both these forms of financing, but I'm talking broadly equity financing, broadly debt financing, face particular barriers. On the equity side, there's a pretty pervasive perception that space activities are very highly risky, and that can really kind of dampen the amount of equity investor interest that you might see. Now, that's not to say it doesn't happen. It does happen in a big way, but I think it would be a mistake to think that, well, every space startup can just go out and sell a stake in that business and get enough money to actually get that project off the ground, literally and figuratively. So that kind of leaves a substantial portion of space startups thinking, well, how else can we get funding? Perhaps debt financing. Now, debt financing, though, comes into the problem that a lender extending a loan want to ensure that they get repaid. So they will request security. Now, lenders have not traditionally viewed space assets as adequate security for a loan. There are many reasons, I think, for this, but at least part of the picture, and this is where the protocol comes into play, at least part of the picture is the legal uncertainty that space activities face across many jurisdictions. In general, I think it's safe to say that space law, like space itself, invites speculation. And indeed, this speculation is what makes it so interesting and so fascinating, why I love talking and researching it, for my job. But these speculations, unfortunately, end up being cold comfort to lenders who simply want to ensure that their loans are repaid. So, in my view, to set the scene, I would say that this uncertainty is a principal barrier to space finance, a principal barrier for the industry as a whole. And of course, it's this uncertainty, at least with respect to security interests in space assets, that the protocol solves for, and why discussions like today are so timely and important.
Neda, you've had some experience with the Cape Town Convention in other areas. Of course, there are 3 additional protocols. There's the aircraft protocol, the railway protocol, and now they're also working on a mining and agriculture protocol. How have these other sectors, which are also very capital intensive, managed to come over some of these barriers? And what has the protocol done to facilitate financing in these fields?
Well, yeah, if we need to talk about the Cape Town system as a whole, obviously developing countries, economies in transition, and small-sized companies will be among the ones that will be benefiting from new forms of finance the most that the Cape Town system introduces. Because as Jack said, states used to have monopoly over the space sector, But now there's this increase of tendency towards, for instance, if we need to talk about space sector, there's this tendency towards commercial exploration among private entities as well. And also with small satellite activities becoming more relevant and more popular, even low budget players such as developing countries, academic institutions, and small size entrepreneurs started to get more involved in space related activities and researches. Yeah, but on the other hand, high risk and large amount of investments needed for, in our case, space activities, but also it was the case with aviation sector as well, makes it difficult for, especially for those players to exist, let alone compete in the market, right? So to make these sectors, to make space particularly accessible, not only theoretically, but also practically to everyone, we ought to provide a source of finance for their operations at better conditions and rates. So yeah, from that point of view, we can say the new forms of Cape Town system introduces will provide a source of access to space, especially for private companies in developing countries that may face difficulties in finding capital to purchase or lease a space asset. But this was the case with, as I said, aviation sector as well. Because under normal circumstances, financiers and lessors may abstain from doing business with local operators in developing countries whose court systems and legal regimes may be assumed to be less established. But thanks to the Cape Town system and the harmonized international legal regime it offers, and also sui generis remedies it introduces, the markets which were previously deemed too risky for creditors to lend in to become safer. But to be honest, when talking about the benefits that the Cape Town system introduces to the players involved in cross-border financing, we can easily say that there's a butterfly effect, because at the end of the day, there is not just one single actor benefiting from the system, right? So again, taking aviation financing practice as an example, we can easily say that the financiers are awarded with the sui generis remedies that are internationally registerable and enabling them, say, to take repossession and control of the aircraft and have it registered and exported when needed. So since the financiers, thanks to these remedies, will feel more comfortable while granting loans, the financing costs are likely to decrease, and this will result in the growth of the aircraft manufacturing sector, but this again will apply in the sector as well. And finally, the interests of lessees, meaning air carriers, also protected by the system, because thanks to the reduced financing costs, they will be able to operate more aircraft, which will lead to a larger fleet, an increased number of flights and decreased ticket prices, and which will eventually be for the benefit of the passengers. So I understand based on our practice in aviation financing sector, that will be the desired outcome for space sector finance. So I can say in the cases there's from manufacturers and financiers to carriers will have benefits.
Thanks, Neda. Chris, back in the day when you were working on the Bigelow space habitats, I'm curious, what did y'all have in mind back then for folks to be able to purchase and to operate a space habitat? And what other types of technologies are we seeing today that are really asset intensive, or that are highly dependent on the hardware that you initially need to work on for a space operation?
Yeah, this is still, I think, a bit of an unclear question for at least for the habitat industry and for other companies that manufacture space architecture. Um, there's a lot of different considerations that we went through, at Bigelow, and the Bigelow model was a leasing model. That's what we had set it up. So the company would lease to customers. But working for someone like Mr. Bigelow, I mean, he has the finances to do this all himself, so he doesn't necessarily need a bank. Although there were other layers to this that could have been included. Now that Bigelow doesn't really operate anymore, but at the time, we were thinking about how do we move forward on this. And one of the driving mechanisms, as you may recall, was the Bigelow Aerospace payload review request to the FAA about putting a habitat on the moon. And so those discussions, I think, especially for me, opened up a lot of different considerations that I don't necessarily hear. And maybe because we're at such a technical level with the protocol, like just from a business perspective, what are the issues, right? So the first issue is going to be, what space tech are we talking about? The second issue is, how do you appraise that tech? And then second is, what is its resell ability? And with the leasing model, we weren't contemplating selling, but putting architecture, for example, in orbit or on the moon. But those two different locations, I think, present two completely different economic models. And on one hand, when you're dealing with the orbital model, I think it's the reason I said it's unclear, because it kind of still fits in with many of the criticisms and objections from the satellite industry. Well, their initial criticisms were focused around the current economic system that they process through satellites on the finance side. But from my perspective, you have a lot of satellites that their entire business model ends when they burn up in the atmosphere. So you can't really transfer or resell anything if the intent and purpose of that satellite is to eventually be destroyed. But I think the one interesting thing that's certainly happened in the last few years and was beginning when I was at Bigelow was the satellite servicing area. Okay, well, now you change the story, right? Now you can extend life, and that wasn't necessarily baked into, I think, the appraisal processes then. Now I think they're starting to. I know a lot of companies that are developing space tugs and other architecture to move things around cislunar space. Those things are intended to stay up there for a long time, be refueled, be replaced. They're not, especially if they're up in geo, they're not gonna, their destiny isn't necessarily to burn up in the atmosphere, but maybe placed in a graveyard orbit. Well, that may provide, if you have a future satellite that does a lot of robust things, like, for example, there are lots of different concepts on the space architecture tugs, how they manipulate the spacecraft in some way. So that may have long-term value that you can certainly quantify. But on the other hand, you still have the risk factor of just being in orbital space. You still have debris issues. You still have maybe authorization issues. You still may have concerns about security, attribution. What are you doing? How are you doing it? And so that leads additional risk analysis, especially as it goes towards reselling or appraisal. So to a large extent, what I think that's sort of a very proto market that I don't think it's very clear that's going to match up. But I think and I'll leave it on this point, I think the most important thing is to think about, okay, well, we want to put all this architecture on planetary bodies. I think it's a completely different story, because you have a lot of additional issues, right? Because now you're placing it at a fixed position, and you're not going to burn it up in the atmosphere at this point. The intent of going to the trouble of building a habitat like a B330 and put it on the lunar surface means you at least, one, assume to have a customer that will justify it being there. Two, because it's there now, you can find any future customer that may want to utilize it. And three, because it's on the moon, you need to pay for all the logistical resources to be able to use it. And this is all, this can all be quantified much easier. The risk analysis makes a lot more sense. But then you have the major problem, which is okay, so if a Bigelow habitat, you know, he funds it himself, he puts it on the moon, he leases it out. Okay, Bigelow goes to, like a company like Bigelow or some other company goes defunct. Now you have this architecture and assets up there. Well, that to me makes sense because one, the way that the protocol is structured, I think it gives enough to be aware of where these things are. Because the last thing that we need is, let's sort of say, blight, right? I mean, if people just started leaving the architecture all over, let's say, the lunar surface and never use it, then we have a whole other problem, right? And that will start implicating national security issues because of the export control, at least from the American side of things. Obviously, the United States government probably is not going to be happy with private sector companies leaving export controlled property on the moon. So there's always going to be an incentive tied to use it, at least the expectation being. So I think to that extent, then maybe you can attract, you know, banks. And that's sort of where I think this really starts to come in. If you have and build up larger settlements, and it doesn't have to be on the moon, it could be anywhere. But when you start to aggregate additional resources or assets to multiply what your mission can do, I think that changes a lot of things. And it looks like a more complete package that does have not only a steady revenue stream, but are fixed assets that can always be attached. You know where they are, you could go to a court, et cetera, with the added benefit of registration. I mean, that's, I think, the most important part.
Yeah. And these are all activities that I think, you know, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we were talking about it, I mean, here's Saroy Good's official commentary. He's in here talking about space hotels. And I know back then a lot of folks would have said, you know, this still seems quite far off. But today, when we start talking about what is possible and what we're likely looking at in the years ahead, it's not so out of this world, as it were. Anna, Hamza, I want to come back to you all a little bit and just talk about how the space protocol works, what it does, and what its scope is supposed to be. Anna, maybe I can just start with you. What is a space asset? You know, what kinds of objects are we talking about, and what distinguishes a space asset from, say, maybe an aircraft asset?
Thank you very much, Daniel. First of all, let me put this into context very briefly. You have mentioned the fact that the space protocol is part of the Cape Town Convention system, which also includes other protocols. And you also mentioned not only the already in force and very successful aircraft protocol, but also the rail protocol and the recently adopted, so it's not a project, it was really adopted and already attracting a lot of interest, the mining, agricultural and construction protocol, the MAC Pretoria protocol adopted in 2019. Now, the whole idea of the Cape Town Convention system is that you have a general convention that sets forth the general and uniform rules for asset-based financing in these specific sectors. And the innovative idea is to facilitate the use of asset-based financing where the users of high-value access need the finance to acquire or get to use the equipment, and give creditors legal predictability where this is difficult to obtain. For example, because it's a transnational situation or because the domestic legal system does not provide for an effective secure transaction regime. So in a way, there are many elements that are common to all protocols because they are contained in the Cape Town Convention itself, and because protocols tend to follow the example, which is a winning example of the aircraft protocol. But there are, of course, and you have focused on one of these elements, there are, of course, a number of elements that have to be specific for the specific industry that is included within the scope of the Cape Town Convention. And this is particularly true for the space protocol for various aspects, and Hamza will probably deal with some of them. First of all, the idea to have protocols adapting the Cape Town Convention to the specific needs of a sector, an economic sector, is because the equipment is different. And therefore, there will be the need of different rules because of the special nature of the equipment. And in this case, we have the space objects or space assets. And let me read what is now the definition of a space asset, because we have to put ourselves, as Daniel said, some years ago, when the protocol was developed, the main asset that was considered to be a space object, a space asset, was of course the satellite. And therefore, the whole idea was that the protocol would be geared to create international interests arising from either a security agreement or a retention of title, or also a leasing on satellites. But then there was a second idea, which was, what about parts of satellites that might be independently financed? Could we use this asset-based financing separately for these parts of a satellite? For example, transponders, which might have their own value and might be financed by a different means, by a different contract, and by a different party. So this was another element that was taken into account and was particularly important because in the Cape Town Convention system, we have the protocols, and then we have the implementation of the protocol through the regulations and rules that pertain to the international registry, and each protocol is supposed to have its own registry. And in rules that were developed by the Preparatory Commission to implement the space protocol, with reference to the type of asset that could be the object of could be within the scope of the protocol, there are additional rules that were developed in agreement with the representatives participating in the Preparatory Commission in order to ensure that when you have when you use the space protocol to finance a part of a satellite, you do it because that part of the satellite has bankability, has its own value, and there are also special rules in the protocol itself to ensure that when you have a interest in different parts of the satellites, these interests are find a solution. There is a solution to the priority situation in order for creditors to have more predictability in these situations. Let
me just ask you real quick on that point, just in terms of applicability. Could you take out separate interests in different segments of the International Space Station?
This is what the regulations say. They say abstractly, it is possible to do that. There is no limit in the protocol itself to the fact that some parts of a bigger, let's say, a space object, which could be a space station, it's not necessarily only the satellite itself, they could be the object of the space protocol. I'm sorry, they could be included in the scope of the space protocol. But the question is that for the moment, you don't have a specific list of those elements that could be included in the scope of the protocol. So abstractly, yes, but the idea is that the regulations will more clearly determine what will be within the scope of the protocol by consultation with the relevant industry, because the element and the support of the industry is, of course, particularly important. And this will be made very clear and will be specified in the regulations themselves. So this might engender a question. Is this then not predictable? Is this then too open? And the answer is no, it is not too open, because the whole idea is that for the moment, at least, only those elements that can ensure a separate bankability and a separate financeability are included. And but in order for other parts of space objects to be included, they should be included in a list which is agreed upon in the regulations.
And publicly available, of course.
Exactly. So, but maybe Hamza can.
Yes, Daniel, if I may come in here. So as you probably know better than I do, treaty making and negotiation is a tireless process, and it takes a long time to put together an instrument such as the Space Protocol or any other treaty in general. But I think that's for good reason, right? So it allows people to come together and discuss all of these ideas and issues that could come up years beyond the time that they were negotiating the treaty. And so if you look at the Space Protocol right now, and I have it in front of me right now, Article 1.2K is where you find the definition of a space asset. And back when it was being negotiated, many of these things were unheard of, but the article itself talks about things such as space stations, space modules, space capsules, space vehicles, reusable launch vehicles. And then when you dig into what the drafters intended by each one of those terms, and all of that discussion can be found in the official commentary that you were looking at, it talks about things such as space hotels, outposts in space, and all of these things have been considered, which is absolutely remarkable. But at the same time, ensures that this treaty is future-proof and can accommodate the needs of the industry that it's supposed to apply to.
Let me put you on the spot a little bit, Hamza.
Yeah.
The Virgin Galactic White Knight 2, or the rocket ship 2. Does that qualify as a space asset?
Absolutely. I mean, I did some research when I saw those launches. I was super excited, and then I picked up the official commentary and dug into it and found paragraph 320, which talks about what exactly a spaceship is and what it means to be a spaceship, right? So as long as, according to the official commentary on the Space Protocol, if an object is designed to carry passengers briefly into space before returning to Earth, this would not be classified as a space asset, but would rather be treated as an aircraft that perhaps falls under the scope of the aircraft protocol. But at the same time, it's important to remember that it's not the Space Protocol's place to answer questions such as what is the definition of space, where does space start, and things like that. The Space Protocol provides for coverage to things such as reusable launch vehicles, and if an object serves as a reusable launch vehicle, whereas it deploys satellites or other objects into space, that would certainly count. So many of the rockets that SpaceX uses that come back down to Earth would definitely be included. At the same time, if space vehicles are included, and then what qualifies as a space vehicle is an entire discussion that is to be had when these assets, like Anna said, become bankable, right? To answer the other question you asked about, parts of the International Space Station, they thought about that. There's an article 17.3 of the Space Protocol that specifically deals with physically connected objects in space. And there are qualifiers as to when security interests in those could be enforced and when they cannot be enforced. So for example, if there is a space habitat connected to a space station and enforcing an interest over that habitat would not impact the functionality of the space station, then yes, absolutely, that interest can be enforced. But at the same time, if a change in that physically linked object would detrimentally impact the big space object, then no, that has specific exceptions, that has specific procedures that need to be followed. So I think the space protocol certainly does cover for some of the new space type of things that we're looking at these days. And I get really excited when I, see some of these new developments and then think about these scenarios where you would apply the space protocol to them. Yeah.
Some of the new in-space manufacturing platforms, I think, could also be really good candidates for use in this sense. Jack, I wanted to come back to you. I think you've been monitoring a lot of the activities that have been happening in terms of financing in space. And so one question that I would have is, has there been any real case scenarios that you've seen recently where you've thought, wow, the space protocol could have facilitated this situation in or helped to resolve the situation in some way that otherwise was more complicated?
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll talk to the facilitation point, because I think that's very salient when you look at transactions that have happened recently. So in mind, I've got two from the region that I'm speaking to you from. That's Asia Pacific. I'm coming to you from Singapore, and each of these projects was for a I think it's fair to say fairly traditional large geostationary satellite. The amounts being sought for financing were in the hundreds of millions, so these are big transactions. And both ended up, as is very common for this kind of project, being project financed. And so project financing, in my view, can be conceptualized as a very a particularly complex form of asset-based financing. It's just that the assets, instead of being, perhaps hard assets like a satellite or something, in a project financing structure, the lenders are really looking primarily to customer contracts, that is locked in, high value, durable contracts. That's what they're looking for to get repaid and to secure the amounts they extend. So project financing is an incredibly useful structure. I don't want anyone to understand my comments on these transactions to imply that it's not a good structure. It's very useful, particularly for infrastructure projects, airports. It does a lot of great stuff. But I think it's fair to say that it's fairly expensive. Transaction costs are very high. And that's because it's complex and it's lengthy. So, you as the borrower end up having to pay your lawyers and your bankers and the absolute army of other professionals who are involved in putting together a project financing structure. You end up having to pay them a lot of money. So that can cause, a bit of heartache for particularly for companies where it might be their first satellite. So one of these projects I'm talking about, it was actually their first satellite. And so spending that kind of cash on lawyers and bankers, as great as lawyers and bankers are, can be a bit painful. So look, I don't want to say, again, both financings were very successful. And I don't think it would be fair to say that if the protocol was in place, it would have made either financing a complete walk in the park. High value, funded by a variety of public and private sources. These were complex transactions. But I can't help but feel that the timeframes could have been, compressed, and the cost could have been significantly lower for both of them if the protocol was in place. And more specifically, I think it would have reduced the size of the security package that each transaction required. So I just mentioned that, project financing has an extensive security package primarily comprised of these customer contracts. Well, that security package for satellite project financing will usually include the satellite, but that's often just kind of chucked in as something that you just put in the document. It's not something that the lenders ever expect to have to rely on. And that comes back, in my view, to that uncertainty point that I raised earlier. And that, as Anna and Hamza have been explaining, the protocol goes a long way to resolving. So I think it could have made things easier, is how I'll put it. It definitely could have facilitated these particular project financings in this region, and I think that'd be fairly safe to say that can extend, on a kind of pretty global level. That just having that extra mechanism there to make the ability, well, to grant the ability or perhaps grant the comfort for a lender to really look at the satellite as their primary asset. I think the benefits could be very tangible and widely appreciated.
Neda, and coming back to you on that very same topic, who are the states that you think would likely see a value in the space protocol? I mean, just given your experience with the other protocols, what types of countries do you think are looking at the space protocol and thinking that could really be our ticket to better access to space capabilities?
Excuse me, I just lost the connection.
Sorry,
can you just
which countries do you see as as being the most favorable towards the space protocol? Where do you think the space protocol would have, or there would be the most appetite for this type of financing?
So yeah, actually, I've mentioned a little bit about this before. The developing countries and which are willing to enter into the market, but which cannot find sufficient funding in their own country, I think would be the target audience and would be very much interested in ratifying and being a part of space protocol, because they will seek for foreign funding from big economies, and thanks to the security.
Oh, I think we're losing the connection. Neda, I think we're losing you. Do you want to just turn off your video?
Big economies as be able to
Yeah, I think we're losing Neda. Neda, if you can, just turn off your video. Let's see if we can get her back. In the meantime, Chris, let's come back also to this idea of you alluded to earlier to potentially a secondhand market for satellites. Now, some of the big telecommunication satellites that we've seen in the past, like the really expensive ones, have a lifespan of sometimes 20 years. What do you think could be done in terms of maybe moving some of these satellites to other orbits or other areas where maybe certain parts of the world where they don't need a cutting edge satellite? What do you think there's a market to be able to move some of the space existing technology and selling them at a discount for continued use?
It's hard to say because of the newer systems, the newer constellations that are getting put up, whether or not those just automatically make the older, bigger buses obsolete. I think certainly if there was, I'm not entirely sure of like the governmental interests around the world to repurpose other satellites for telecommunications. I think there are a lot of daunting issues, in particular, making sure that you have the internal infrastructure within the territory to get those data from the satellites to make it worthwhile. I don't think it's entirely clear that which way the market's going to go yet, and I think that on one hand it is about what is available on the market and what's up there, but I think policy problems here on Earth when it comes to debris, mitigating potential collisions through communications, I think it increases it puts off investors to want to invest or seek any sort of security in an architecture that's in orbital space. I think that's just first and foremost like where we have to begin. So you have to find justifications to overcome that. And to the extent that there are other companies right now, there are several that could move these things, physically move these things around and repurpose them. I think it's that exercise is more of a function of an interest of states to see, can you just move things around rather than could you move things around and then repurpose them for commercial purposes? So I don't think it's foreclosed, but I think it's a little bit opaque in terms of the way that that economy would develop. And again, it goes back to my point about appraisal, right? Because if you're saying that bus will produce X amount of revenue per year, well, what is its long-term depreciating value over time? Especially when you decide what orbit to put it at, which is a whole other issue. And you know, for things that are already in established orbits, it's not even clear to me that there's even a critical mass of satellites that could be repurposed in the next 20 years that would be useful when, again, you look at the pressures, the competitive pressures from larger constellations of smaller satellites. So, you know, I think someone might come along and see this as a great opportunity. But if you're privately funding this, then it probably doesn't really make sense. Now, the whole point is that you have a lot of other proposals out there with respect to building bigger structures in orbit. And I know we talked about repurposing component parts. Well, that's also an interesting thing, but then that's also juxtaposed with the security question. So, you know, if we're thinking about you know, R2D2 going up there and starting to cannibalize buses for their workable parts, that presents a completely different paradigm, but it is one where we're moving towards. So it's not like I'm saying this out of jest. It's like it's really going in that direction. The software is so sophisticated now, and it's only going to get better. So really, it's what hardware is valuable, and that goes back to this point about appraising, like what is valuable. And I think that's the hardest thing to determine, and I think that's going to be a case by case basis.
Daniel, if I may come in here, I think
please.
Exactly that, right? I mean, all of what Chris said sort of makes me think about some of the major insolvencies that have happened in the satellite industry, right? What Jack said, what Chris said, and then you think about cases such as Iridium back in the day to OneWeb recently. You know, these have all been examples of where it would have been helpful for, you know, potentially a secondary market of satellites or space assets to be out there that worked, that allowed, you know, other operators to come in and decide for themselves whether or not they can make anything out of these satellites that are already in these specific orbits, performing these specific tasks. But at the same time, as technology develops, if there was to be another, you know, Iridium type insolvency, you would have satellites that could, you know, receive updates and then perform tasks that might be slightly different, or, you know, have enough propulsion capacity that they might be maneuvered to a certain extent to perform another task, right? So, yeah.
Yeah, Hamza, well, let me just ask you this, and Chris kind of already alluded to this issue, but, you know, how do you see the space protocol applying in a world of small sats and CubeSats that are designed to only last for a few years?
So I think that's a good question, right? And I think the space protocol applies as long as, and is useful as long as the object in question has, so there's two sides to that answer. One is to get these small sats into space, right? So there are a lot of developing countries out there, that there are a lot of emerging space economies out there that want to fund, that want to have these projects where they launch small satellites into space, but just don't have the capacity to fund these, you know, companies or these objects to get to space. And so having something like the space protocol out there, through which they could get access to credit at a cheaper cost, would A, help them get to space, and B, make investors feel a lot more secure in financing these companies. And then the second part of the answer, whether or not, you know, these satellites are things that people would want to repossess and sell forward, that is entirely on a case-by-case basis. And it completely depends on whether or not that particular satellite will be able to serve another purpose, and if there will be a market for that satellite, right? So this is, for example, a challenge that we recently saw where a lot of airlines were going into insolvency, but at the same time, lessors and financiers didn't really want their airplanes back because there was no market to sell them onto, right? So these types of things are determined by market conditions, how valuable an asset is, and financiers sort of undertaking their own assessments of whether or not it makes sense to repossess this or do something with it. And that's not entirely a thing we need to look at. What we need to look at is the first part of the equation, right? Providing access to credit, making sure emerging countries and in new space economies have access to the same amount of money at similar costs to get their projects into orbit and beyond. And I think that's where the space protocol can really come in and make an impact.
Could you possibly give us a bit of an update in terms of, like maybe what countries are showing interest, where you see the space protocol in terms of development right now? Of course, we know that there are 10 ratifications required for the space protocol. There's been lots of talk about, how it would be structured and what the framework would look like in practice. Can you give us an update as to where we are before we start getting to some of the questions that are coming from the audience?
Yes, sure. Thank you, Daniel. As you said, we need 10 ratifications in order for the protocol to enter into force. And for the moment, we only have 4 signatory states. I say only, but that was already a good thing because the protocol was actually very new at the time. It was adopted, and it's in a way it was opening up, as you very well said, the possibilities for the future, for the development of space financing. So the 4 signatory states are Burkina Faso, Germany, Saudi Arabia, and Zimbabwe. But it is true that we have received informally and also during various discussions expressions of interest of other countries. And I must say, as Neda said, especially those countries which would like to develop a sector, a space sector, also using it from an economic point of view, also including private capital, not only private capital, but including also private capital, and at the moment are looking for better possibilities to do that. And so countries in Africa, for example, and countries also in other parts of the world. As far as the architecture of the implementation, I don't want to bore everyone with the technicalities of this, but it's important to say that it was already pointed out that the registry is at the center of the functioning of the protocol, and this registry is not yet there for the space protocol, and the architecture of the registry also includes a supervisory authority, which is an international body ensuring that the registry does what it should do. So it's a very important element in the system. For example, for the aircraft protocol, it's ICAO having this important function. So there are all these issues: the issue of appointing a registry, a registrar for developing the registry, of appointing also the supervisory authority and implementing this, that become very important when we are nearer to reaching the number of ratifications that are required. But at the same time, there was preparatory work done in this respect. And so, for example, draft regulations for the future registry were already developed, and they are now in a very good shape. And they take into account some of the elements that the protocol itself deferred to the regulations. And secondly, there was already a lot of work and discussion with reference to the appointment of the supervisory authority. So the organization that was involved from the start in the work of the space protocol was the ITU, because at the time, the most important possible use was seen as you said, in the realm of the telecommunications. And the ITU actually discussed the possibility to become a supervisor authority in 2018 at the Plenipotentiary Conference. This in the end, the ITU resolved not to accept this role at that stage because it seemed to be premature, but left open the possibility for UNIDROIT to submit a further invitation in the future to reconsider the issue. And they also instructed the Secretary General to continue to participate in the work of the preparatory commission. And so UNIDROIT is, of course, trying to engage and looking also at other organizations and at other possible candidates. But as I said, it's a work in progress because we are now a bit further away from the actual implementation, a practical implementation, but we have to think about these things. And then there is the element of engaging the new segments of industry because and this is why we have this webinar, in order for people to know that the space protocol exists and can apply in many different, for the financing of many different activities in space. So maybe Hamza can also say something about this. He's done a lot of work in this area. But as I said, UNIDROIT is working, and the people interested in the space protocol are working towards the implementation of this very good piece of legislation, if we can say so ourselves.
Of course you could say so yourself. Hamza, please, anything to add?
No, I think Anna is entirely correct. And I think one of the feelings that I sometimes get is that the space protocol might have been a little ahead of its time, but now is sort of the time where interest is growing very rapidly. There's lots of emerging space economies and industry participants from the new space sector that are very keenly interested in the opportunities and the potential that the space protocol could unlock within the space sector. There are gaps in access to credit that have been identified by various international bodies within the space sector, and the space protocol has a model, or is built on a model, that has proven to fix those gaps for other industries. And so I think with panels like this and with discussions in general, we do want to help governments understand the benefits of the space protocol, what it could do for them, but at the same time, reassure industry and everyone else that the space protocol being available would have no bearing on the existing forms of finance that are presently available, that whether that be private equity, whether that be through project financing, or whether that be through institutional investments. Those would all continue to exist and would not be impacted at all by the availability of an international secure transactions law system that would only be applicable and useful to those companies and entities that are looking to use it, right? So we're very keen to sort of have those conversations with governments, with the industry, with financiers to see how we can enable asset-based financing in the space sector. Yeah.
Yeah, and I would always remind folks that the applicability of the space protocol, of course, depends on the location of the debtor. So a debtor country can be a part of the space protocol and then go out to other countries that may or may not necessarily be, or go to banks and financial institutions in other countries that may or may not be signatories, and still the space protocol would apply in that particular instance. I'm going to turn over now to the audience. There's plenty of questions that have been coming in. The first one that I would like to bring up, it comes from Rob Cowan. So if that is Rob Cowan from Avioretto, hello, good sir. It's been a long time. Rob asks, would the space protocol help in cases where there are multiple creditors over one asset? So probably having an inter-creditor agreement between them that establishes who gets paid first. So how would the space protocol handle that situation? Anna, Hamza?
Maybe I can take this first part of the question, and then the more specific discussion on how this is, the practical application in the space sector. I would leave it to the real experts in this panel. But it's very important to note what Rob notes in his comments. The priority of competing interests is taken into account in the Cape Town Convention system, of course, because of the registry. So it's the international registry establishing the priority on the base of the date of registration. So this is the first predictability for creditors. And if there are more creditors, this is the main rule. But at the same time, it is perfectly true that this priority can be varied by agreement between the holders of those interests. And these are intercreditor agreements that are done very commonly in various sectors and are recognized by the Cape Town Convention and also applicable to this protocol. At the same time, it is also possible to register, so to render public and therefore also effective a subordination agreement, for example. And therefore, different creditors can sort out their interests in a way that it's also effective towards third parties. So I would stop here, and maybe others can.
Let me follow up on that,
Yes,
because one of the interests that sometimes gets subordinated includes insurers' interests. And I understand that the Space Protocol has made some special provisions thanks to the tireless efforts of Pamela Meredith. How does that get taken into account, Anna?
The salvage interests, let's say, they are actually not affected by the protocol, by the registration of security interest, and also by the effectiveness of the protocol. So the whole idea is that this industry is not directly affected by the way the protocol applies. At the same time, of course, from a practical and economic perspective, if you have more financing in the space sector and a financing that makes use of also asset-based financing methods, then of course also the insurance industry has more to do, and therefore, economically speaking, this is an advantage also for the insurance industry. But legally speaking, there was a lot of care, as you said, put into allowing these salvage rights to be protected.
And Jack, I might turn to you for the second part of that question, but do we know roughly, does anybody have any figures on how much is spent annually on space hardware, really? And I might just open that up to you, Jack. We heard some predictions earlier about how big we can expect the space economy to be by the year 2040. I think some folks would probably say $1.1 trillion annually might be a little bit much, but do you see that as being an accurate reflection of where the space economy is going? And again, like, how do you see the space protocol potentially enabling other countries and actors to become a part of that economy?
Yeah, so on the first point, I think I'd have to confess that I see a lot of figures thrown around, and I see the amounts they're going through transactions. I don't think this 1 trillion by 2040 figure is completely out of the question, but a lot of this stuff comes down to who's telling you these figures, how are they slicing and dicing it, are they double counting, which is something you can often see. So in terms of dollar figures, there's a lot of information out there, and it all depends on how exactly you define the space economy. Does it extend down to purchase of satellite phones, or is it just purchase of satellites? Is it does it include the tickets for a suborbital tourism flight? Like, these kind of questions mean that the statistics or the figures can be tortured into saying pretty much whatever anyone wants them to. But on your second point about how this could perhaps bring on board more countries around the world into this quite large and growing industry. I think it actually ties back to something that Nate mentioned, and if we're talking about the protocol, I think one of the great things it does, and you can see this as well with the aircraft protocol, is that it provides much more of a level playing field when you're coming to, compare legal regimes across jurisdictions. There's various perceptions that particular courts might not be reliable in particular countries, that particular legal regimes are not, able to cope with large transactions and whatnot. And it's irrelevant whether, those end up being true, because if they're true in the minds of commercial parties, then they kind of end up replicating that and therefore always choosing, for example, and I'm just picking it out, always choosing to, structure that transaction in London as opposed to closer to where the actual, center of economic activity is. And so what I can see the protocol doing there is really much more leveling that playing field by saying, well, look, you might be concerned about the ability of our courts or our law to handle these transactions, but we've signed on to the protocol, we've implemented in domestic law. It looks exactly like it does over in the UK. It looks exactly like it might, in another jurisdiction that's implemented it, that might be, particularly well regarded for commercial activities. And I think that leveling of the playing field, it might seem like, perhaps a theoretical thing, but I think it really does increase accessibility and ultimately increase, I think it would, participation in that industry by just making everyone, starting from, I guess, a particular standard when it comes to the enforceability of security interests in space assets.
Well, let me follow up on that. And Anna, Hamza, you two are totally excluded from this question that I'm going to propose. Maybe it's a little controversial, but Jack, could you see a situation where you have countries like, Philippines, Indonesia, Hong Kong, Vietnam, South Africa, a number of these smaller new space actors who take advantage of the space protocol and sign up to it, and you could see a situation where there is a grouping of maybe these new startup countries that are just getting involved in space. Could you see a situation where there is a constellation or a network of these countries that are then able to use the space protocol to go to banks, perhaps in London or Berlin or in New York to try and get funding from these investors?
100%, and I don't just see it being a possibility. I'd wholly encourage it. I think it's an incredibly powerful way for countries that have been traditionally, not centers of space activity, to really gain a bigger piece of the pie. You mentioned, for example, in Asia Pacific, what would it look like if every jurisdiction here, ratified and implemented the protocol? I think it would be a big change. I think it would be an incredibly powerful move, and I really think it would just energize the whole, space industry environment around here. And I'd probably just add on there that that's not just to the extent that, the protocol is excellent at providing for, as I mentioned, the enforceability of security interests in space assets. It's also just how it gets people thinking. And by people there, mainly meaning policymakers, gets them engaging with the issues that come up when you're dealing with, space assets. What, whose law, what law applies in outer space? These kind of fundamental questions are often not, really entertained by the lawyers within ministries of law and attorney general's chambers in quite a few jurisdictions. It's just simply too obtuse to really kind of warrant serious contemplation. And one of the great things about the protocol, I think, is it really drives it home that this is something that if they engage with, there are real commercial benefits to it, to their countries. And so it's not yet just the formal mechanisms that it provides, I should say, it's just the socialization of the idea that space is something for many countries to be involved in, and that they can be involved in it, but that they do need to think through some of the legal issues that arise.
Neda, do you have any thoughts on that? Do we still have you? I think we might have lost her.
No, actually, I cannot turn my video on. I'm sorry, my connection.
That's all right. Don't worry.
It's really bad.
But yeah, do you have any thoughts on that question about seeing a constellation of emerging space countries signing up to the space protocol and then using that as a platform to gain access to resources in more developed areas?
Yeah, actually, I want to talk more about, again, sui generis remedies here as a practicing lawyer, because I find them the most important element of the whole system. Because conventional remedies under other forms of finance would consist of having various in rem rights, such as contractual or statutory liens, mortgages, which a creditor would be able to enforce on the asset by having it seized or seized and eventually sold by judicial or private sales. And this would make you end up at a court. And if you end up at a court to solve a dispute, especially in a developing country whose legal system and courts are generally not very much predictable, it can take some time and patience, so to say, for you to be legally satisfied, right? That's, as I said, that's where I think the importance of the Cape Town system comes to the fore, because it eases the financing of high value objects by establishing a predictable and uniform regime for creditors. And this regime can be possible mainly by effective practice and prompt enforcement of rights and remedies that other forms of finance may not have available. So again, as a practicing lawyer, the main focus on cross-border aircraft financing transactions, I can say that almost in every transaction, we receive a considerable amount of questions on the applicability and effectiveness of the Cape Town remedies in Turkey, because lessors and financiers are seeking for a safety, and apparently the sui generis remedies introduced by the Cape Town system provides discomfort more than our national legal remedies, which they are not familiar with. So, for example, IDRA, which is a fixed form from annexed to aircraft protocol, gives the registration and export authority to the creditor, and this form becomes effective once it is duly executed and duly registered with the registry authority. So, in case of a continuing default, if the lessor or creditor want, for example, aircraft back, and there is no possibility to agree with the lessee, at least in the near future, then applying the IDRA route rather than seeking a court order is likely to make more sense, as the national courts, particularly who does not have sufficient expertise on aviation matters or space matters, may refrain from making a desired ruling. So, but as in our example, the IDRA route, I mean, this sui generis remedy introduced by the Cape Town system and aircraft protocol, on the other hand, is much easier to apply, since the addressee of IDRA will be the registration authority, which is generally supposed to be more familiar with aviation-related issues than a national court. So I wanted to just mention a little bit more about these kind of sui generis remedies, because, as I said, I think these remedies will be the reasons why creditors will be investing to the markets which deemed previously too risky. So that's how the developing countries will be able to get more involved in those specific sectors.
Yeah. Of course, for lawyers and financiers, we don't like to do anything new. We want to do something the way we did it before and be able to do it over and over and over again without having to do any innovative new things, because innovation often brings a lot of challenges and a lot of work, but that's what we're trying to establish here. So we are starting to come to the end, but before we do, Hamza, Chris, I'm going to throw this last question over to you, and I want to see what you can bring to this one. Hamza, tell me about the space protocol and space sustainability. Everything that we talk about today is about trying to maintain our ability to continue doing these activities over and over again. What can the space protocol offer? This movement that we have right now about promoting space sustainable, long-term sustainable activities.
Thanks a lot, Daniel. And I think not only is that a good question, but it's also a very important question to understand and address, because as we move towards more and more countries and companies launching objects into space. Space sustainability is something we really need to think about. Any measures that we can take to reduce the number of space debris or satellites in orbit that are not serving any purpose anymore are good for space sustainability. A treaty like the Space Protocol allows for satellites that belong to operators that may have gone insolvent to be taken over or operated by other operators that might be able to derive value from them. And that ensures that less space debris is created. Additionally, once, and I know we get this a lot, that, hey, look, there is no secondary market for satellites. A satellite is a purpose-built machine, and then it will not have any buyers once it breaks down. But at the same time, you need to understand that a satellite is built like that because of the fact that there will never, that there is no secondary market out there. Should a system exist where where operators can get better lending terms for building their satellites in a way that they can be reprogrammed, should they need to be reprogrammed, that in itself is incentive enough for operators to have reprogrammable satellites, to have capacity, to have, you know, reuse of satellites as an option. Just a few weeks ago, I was speaking to a new company that's just been set up in St. Petersburg in Russia, where they want to provide a service where they lend time to people on Earth to use their satellite. So you, Daniel, will have access to data from this satellite for an X amount of time, after which data from this satellite will go to another, you know, service provider here on Earth. And these types of sort of applications of space really do showcase that in the future, there really will be a secondary market for satellites in orbit. And at the same time, a secondary market for assets on other celestial bodies that often do not present the same challenges as fixed, you know, orbital satellites. And so a mechanism through which such objects can easily be transferred from operator A to operator B will definitely be beneficial for space sustainability and can add really good value there. I'm sure Chris knows a lot more about some of these innovative business, you know, ideas that might also be worth exploring here. Yeah.
Chris, tell us about in-space manufacturing.
In-space manufacturing is, I think it's just right at the beginning. I know that there's been a couple of banks that have been interested in at least discussing the state of things. There's a few companies out there that are obviously taking different approaches, Axiom being one. You want to build a habitat to put on the space station. You still have Sierra Nevada, Redwire, and others that are thinking about that level of construction. Then you have another company that was announced recently called Orbital Assembly Company, and they're billing themselves as the first space construction firm, I think. And their approach is to demonstrate how you could, you know, launch a system that could deploy and build out the superstructure on these larger, let's say, space stations. There's certainly engineering challenges to that. There's certainly business challenges to that. So I bring that up as an example because what's interesting for me looking at these companies is, you know, they're obviously presenting themselves as their business model is X, but like what you see with a lot of especially startups, underneath that X are all the little things that could be, let's say, attributable to the assets protocol. And there are certainly elements of this, especially if you put in demonstrators in space that are incomplete and maybe you want someone to pick them up. There are just so many different aspects to this from the commercial perspective, because, you know, from that perspective, it's the costing out, right? So we have this technology trying to demonstrate what are all the costs to do this, what are our timelines. And, you know, a lot of these companies, their timelines are looking over the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, or maybe even to some extent, to be fair, by the end of the decade. But what's interesting to me is one, you still have a lot of private capital flowing into these things. They're building bigger structures, or contemplating bigger structures. At the same time, everyone is already eyeing the fact that the space station has, its days numbered. Like it's still a bit of ways, but once that big thing comes down, what's going to replace it? And I think that's certainly something NASA is certainly keyed to, as his partners are keyed to. How would that be affected by what the Chinese and the Russians want to do? I'm not entirely sure. I think that's the broader picture here. It's there are certain number of countries that engage in the manufacturing of the technologies we're talking about. There's only a few of them that even have the industrial capacity. And you see the way that the Chinese have tried to incentivize commercial space, for example. They've done it in ways that I don't think are conducive to that economy, developing that level of economy. But nevertheless, you see lots of people trying these things. I think the plans that are being discussed, the business plans being discussed, certainly aren't sophisticated or robust enough to think about this level of, well, what happens afterwards? Mostly because, again, like most of these companies aren't looking at banks. But I think the real trend is going to be how the force multipliers of all these different companies start actually putting up the architecture and how it starts to form. And again, going back to whether or not it's an orbital space or on a planetary body. And I think these little distinctions change, certainly as a function of the business plan, but change even the policy considerations and the legal latitude that you have from a business perspective. And I think that's one thing that companies are starting to slowly think about. But what's different is these questions weren't even thought of years ago. They weren't, because of the private capital funding these things. Like no one's thinking about going to a bank and asking for 100 million or $1 billion. So they're finding other innovative ways. So I think that the point I'll leave you with is look to the different innovative vehicles. You may not like SPACs, you may like SPACs, you may like the way other companies like the Seraphim or others are building an ecosystem. But at some point, someone's going to build something that is so valuable, no doubt, and it could be as easy as it's a space asset that has instruments on it, and the instruments are the valuable thing, in the way that like the lenses on TV cameras are way more valuable than the TV camera, everything else around it. So that's sort of the point, and I think that's sort of where the space assets protocol sits in within the commercial industry right now.
Yeah, no, that's a really excellent point, and we'll see how that develops in the next few years. We're running out of time. Would you like to wrap up? Give us any final thoughts from your end?
Thank you very much. I would like those thoughts not to be final, because I think this is opening up to consideration, reconsideration, but also further consideration of different ways the space protocol can be really useful in practice in many different sectors of the space industry, and for many different countries which might have different interests, and they would like to pursue them. So my thanks to you and also to the Space Corps Foundation for allowing UNIDROIT to organize, but also to co-sponsor this event. It's great that we could do that. The second important point is we are happy to receive further questions, further comments, to engage with anyone who might be interested either in knowing more about the space protocol, or in knowing more how, even if they know about the space protocol, how it can be applied in specific sectors. I saw that there was a question for more for UNIDROIT, and more of a policy question on the possibility to re-engage states and industry in looking at these elements. And of course, on the one hand, this is a treaty, an adopted treaty, and we have seen together that the that this treaty already allows the possibility to take into account the future and now present developments, as was pointed out by all of you, starting with the definition of what is a space asset, going through the preservation of powers of contracting states in many situations where states would like to preserve important rights and in sectors that are not touched by the protocol, for example, the authority to issue licenses and so on. So this should also be mentioned. And the preservation of certain important rights, like, as you said, Daniel, the rights of the insurance, and then special remedies that take into account the fact that you cannot really use the more traditional remedies for asset-based financing, like repossession, without some changes. So, but what is important to note is that a discussion and an open discussion on with governments and with emerging industry representatives on ways to make this work in practice, and maybe how to tweak the regulations in such a way as to make this a more practically applicable and appealing. We're very open to that. We're very open for any other suggestions. And so thank you very much, Daniel.
Absolutely, Emma. And Hamza, if you could maybe just drop some contact information into the chat. Ladies and gentlemen, we just have one last announcement. Chris, I think you have some news for us.
Yes, thank you. Well, first of all, I want to thank Anna Veneziano and Hamza and Jack and Nita for being a part of this great panel. We love working with UNIDROIT. You guys are doing great work. So really appreciate this today. My announcement is today we get to announce that the Space Court Foundation has entered into an official agreement with the International Institute of Space Law. The Space Court Foundation will be the regional organizer for North America moving forward for this year. So we're very excited to be working with IISL and continue to be the administrator, the regional organizer for North America for the Manfred Locke Space Law Moot Court competition. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for the support, and looking forward to the next panel.
Thanks a lot, Chris. That's going to be really exciting for the Space Court Foundation as well. Folks, that comes to the end of our webinar. Again, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Hamza and Anna over at UNIDROIT. And again, for anyone that has questions about space law and policy, please feel free to reach out to us at the Space Court Foundation as well. This has been a real treat for me, going back to my roots, as it were. So thank you again to everyone, and we'll see y'all next time.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.